This week on Dig Me Out. With your hosts, Jason Zia and Tim Minichi.
Jay, we're back again with another episode thanks to our Dig Me Out Union on Patreon. You can help us make the next episode happen by joining us at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. Speaking of the union, Jay.
Yeah.
We're joined by a union member on this episode. He was here not too long ago
Woot.
for our Depeche Mode roundtable. Depeche Mode in the 90s.
Yes.
You might remember that from a few months back, where we discussed the band as they had just put out a new record, and it was a good time to discuss that band, obviously, because they were.
I feel like I took a college level course in Depeche Mode with.
I know.
Mhm.
I now know more about Depeche Mode than I know about like Alice in Chains and like all these bands that I supposedly grew up with.
Mhm.
I'm like, I don't really know much about Mike Starr. I know way more about David
Let me
Gahan.
tell you about Alan Wilder.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, without further ado, let's welcome back Ian McIver. Welcome back, Ian.
Hello there.
You brought to us that Depeche Mode roundtable. That was your suggestion, and I believe that this record ties in pretty closely to that. This is the year of the mode.
Yes, that's pretty much every calendar year for me for the past 30 plus years. So, but yes, so I've brought forward Alan Wilder's Recoil, Unsound Methods from 1997. So I mentioned this during the roundtable. So of course, we don't need to go too much in the history of Depeche Mode since we have an episode, but June 1st, 1995, Alan Wilder leaves the band. Prior to leaving the band, he did release a side project, Recoil. He had 3 releases. So in 86, during Black Celebration, he released 1 and 2. And then in 1998, coinciding with Music for the Masses, was Hydrology. The CD release, that was the first one, and also included 1 and 2. So it was a Hydrology plus 1 and 2. And then in 1992, so in between Violator and Songs of Faith and Devotion, I did mention this in the roundtable, he released Bloodline, which had vocals from Douglas McCarthy on the single Faith Healer. Obviously, Alan working with the band in 1991 with the As Is EP, doing the mix for Come Alive, and then the production duties with Flood on Ebhead. And that album also had Tony Halliday of Curve providing vocals, and then Moby as well, under his real name Richard Hall, providing vocals on one track. Moby at the time being on Mute Records. And so after he left the band, there was some light talk. I mean, I don't think anything was ever serious. It was more because Daryl Beaumont left the Depeche Mode organization, went and enjoyed his brother Perry Beaumont with The Cure, and kind of made the offer to join The Cure. Of course, joining a band was the last thing on Alan Wilder's mind. I don't know how serious this was. It seems to be more just cursory prodding, since the bands have had history together and have known each other. So, but he decided, no, I'm going to continue with this project. And so for this album, he continued the trend with working with vocalists. He brought back Douglas McCarthy again. Siobhan Lynch was another vocalist. He came across her through a demo tape. I don't know. I always assumed it was some demo that was sent to Mute. It could have been one that was passed on to him through acquaintances. So since he does production and remix work, so it could have been through that. The other vocalist was Hildia Campbell, who was one of the backup singers on the Devotional tour, and she also provided vocals on Songs of Faith and Devotion with Get Right With Me. And then the last was a spoken word artist, Maggie Estep. Unfortunately, she passed away, I believe, in 2009, and she provided vocals as well. So he was looking kind of for someone to do like a rap, wasn't finding satisfactory for what he wanted, and then came across her more through her spoken word albums and decided, okay, this will work. So that's who we assembled for this album.
And this was released in October 97 on Mute, which is what all the releases were. They were all on Mute. Jay, had you heard Recoil before this, other than when Ian talked about it in the Depeche Mode episode?
No, I had not heard it or known anything about it until then.
I feel like I just kind of like heard it in passing, but never like knew what it was, or because I've listened to a lot of, electronic music and especially in like the trip hop ish electronica, whatever you want to call it, space. And there's a lot of bands that like the names kind of float around, but I never really checked them out, other than sort of like the big bands that most people are familiar with, like Massive Attack or Tricky or stuff like that. So I wasn't really sure what was going on with this. So this is the first record that he releases after leaving Depeche Mode, correct?
Yes, this is his any work. So this is the first work that was done after he left the band. So he didn't pick up any production or remix work. So he took some time off, even after leaving the band, and then started recording this in the fall of 96.
Now, I didn't realize when I was doing my research on his history how many bands he was in before Depeche Mode. So he was in a band called the Hitmen, which that was like 81. And then he was also in a band called the Flatbackers. He was in a band called Reel to Reel there was another band called Reel to Reel. This is a different Reel to Reel. He was in a band called the Corgis. Daphne and the
terrible
Tender
bad
Spots.
names.
And then the first band, Jay, you're gonna appreciate this. The first band was called the Dragons.
Oh my goodness!
Which sounds like it would be like a gothic metal band or something like. But it's called I don't know if it's the single of the album is called Misbehavin', which made me think of the Righteous Gemstones because of the Misbehavin' song.
Yeah. Oh, just wait until we cover a 9 Inch Nails episode, and then we can go through the bands that Trent Reznor was involved with.
Oh, I know.
But when you comment about familiarity, so if you saw 9 Inch Nails in 2000 on the Fragility tour, the follow-up album to this, Liquid, Trent Reznor did use that as part of the pre-show music.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So I noticed that. So that album came out in 2000, and then Subhuman came out in 2007. And there hasn't been anything since then. Is this still an active project, or is he doing other things, or did he retire?
Yeah. So in 2010, he did have the Selected compilation, and spent the year promoting that with the Selected events. And that also continued a bit in 2011 as well. In 2012, that the video from Budapest was released on Blu-ray, and he also executive produced a tribute album to Talk Talk, where he also did 2 tracks. He also did a remix for Alessandro Cortini of 9 Inch Nails for his Sonio. I don't know how to completely pronounce it. It's Italian, and it's a combination of 2 words. But he did do a remix for that, and then last thing he's done, it was in 2016, I believe, for he did a piano for a single for an up and coming artist, Dee Dee, again going back to Daryl Beaumont, who was managing her. So in 2011 he did auction off a lot of gear and memorabilia.
Okay.
I know because I bought some of that. But no, I mean, he hasn't, there's never been anything issued formally for retirement, but I mean, he's spent time raising his family, similar like between 2000 and 2007. I mean, took some time there to be involved with family. Also, currently his estate, the lands, the house is being sold in the UK in Sussex. So, but the building that houses the Thin Line Studios is not part of that sale.
Oh,
so whether that's an indication of any willingness to work, but I mean, you're going to have to assume that like some people, like he was probably responsible with his finances, and obviously with Depeche Mode, especially him being involved with their Imperial phase. I mean, that probably had some good residuals until any music sales for anyone took a tank.
Yeah, based on this time in Depeche Mode, I'm pretty sure he's set for life just in terms of royalties for the amount of singles that have, you know, sold and albums that have sold and continue to stream. I mean, their streaming numbers are, you know, way up there. So I'm sure those pennies are rolling in pretty consistently for him. Yeah. So we'll share our Patreon where the album Better EP Decent Single votes at the end of this. And I do apologize to you because I had this post for the preview ready and then I just forgot to hit the post button. So it went up late. So we didn't get a lot of feedback on this episode from the Patreon community. And I apologize to the whole Patreon community for that. I will. Yeah.
I'm not surprised at the same time. I mean, we've commented on this and Dig Me Out on the Discord before that a lot of the big bands, everyone will come out from the woodwork. I mean, two prime examples from this year, Soundgarden and Hole. But then when it comes to some of the lesser known bands, it's like not as many comments. And so, I mean, this is definitely one that is being dug out because everyone knows of the primary band, Depeche Mode, but obviously never really took much of a deep dive because, I mean, until the 2000s, really, I mean, like this project and even Martin Gore, his EP was released and that was kind of buried in between Music for the Masses, 101, Violators. So, I mean, it wasn't until they were taking time in between to actively promote these items and releases that it was kind of like, okay, if you knew the band and obviously kept up on them, I mean, you weren't going to.
Right. Well, let's get into the record. And talk about what we liked and what we didn't like about this. So Jay, why don't you share one thing you liked about Unsound Methods by Recoil?
The songs are kind of unpredictable, and I like that. Yes, they're soundscapey. There's incorporations of a lot of different like styles of bits and pieces here. I don't want to say songs, but it's like throughout a song you get elements that are jazzy, you get elements that are a little bit rock, you get elements that are kind of 80s electronic, but you kind of don't know where some of these songs are going to go, which I enjoyed quite a bit. I like how they're using vocals too. There's, you know, variety of voices and delivery. So you get this kind of moody, smoky female and male voices coming in. Sometimes even like call and response type things, or at least like two vocals at once, which really I think helps build some of the intensity. It almost had like a electronic Tom Waits feel to it to me sometimes, with how the delivery is and like just like the eclectic mix of instruments coming in. You weren't always sure where things were going. There's a bit of a like dark noir kind of vibe through the whole thing too, which reminded me a bit of some of his stuff. I like that it all builds to a crescendo too. It's not just like, you know, start a loop, let it play for 4 minutes, and then later in instruments. It's building to something in the way that they kind of get there. You're not quite sure when it's going to happen and how you're going to get there, but you eventually get to, you know, some kind of crescendo, which I enjoy quite a bit, from a dynamic standpoint. So it's not just, you know, flat songs. It's very cinematic. I even noticed like one of the songs is credited to Francis Ford Coppola, which I'm assuming is taking samples from his movies or something.
Yeah, that's Incubus. And so the original demo that was sent to Douglas McCarthy did have samples, but then he essentially does an impression of Martin Sheen, but he used that for inspiration for his vocals and the delivery. Yeah. So from Apocalypse Now, so that's why. But it's not like I said, all the lyrics are actually Douglas McCarthy. It's not sampled from the movie.
Gotcha. So yeah, there's this cinematic quality, I think, to the whole record, both musically. You know, they're using strings, kind of string beds, cellos. There's a dynamic like crescendo to the songs, but even like, you know, there's several tracks here that have spoken vocals that read like movie dialogue almost, or you know, a novel, which I thought was really cool too. It added to that sort of unpredictability, like kind of pulled into the story, but then also the music's going along with it. So I thought that was cool. The last thing I thought worked that kind of tied all that together to be something a little bit more relatable. But, you know, there were a couple moments where I could hear the Depeche Mode come through. So Control Freak and Stalker to me had hook parts in them that were very reminiscent of something I'm, you know, might expect to hear in a Depeche Mode song. And I think those moments throughout the record kind of help pull it back from being, you know, extremely experimental to something that's a little bit easier to get your hands around, a little bit more accessible and like familiar. So yeah, I think those elements coming together was what I liked the most. What worked for you, Tim?
Well, I agree with you. The cinematic aspect of this in a lot of ways reminded me of a band like Unkle, where it almost it sounds like a predating Unkle in a lot of ways, this record, even though I know it's like within a year or two of the Unkle record. I think it's like 98 or 99, that first Unkle release. I don't remember.
Yeah, science fiction. Yeah, I think that's 98.
So, and I love that aspect where you take, you know, what is essentially trip hop, with we heard that in the 90s with every Massive Attack and Portishead and, you know, artists that I've mentioned, and adding little twists here and there. It reminded me of like listening to Martin Gore's solo stuff. He did some EPs recently, and you hear the Depeche Mode like sort of vibe, but he takes it in a different direction. The best way I put it, like those, like the Martin Gore stuff sounded like a lot of the instrumental tracks that you would hear on Depeche Mode records. And this it's strangely enough, there's parts of this that do remind me of Depeche Mode in the 90s, specifically Ultra, which comes out, same time. And where it has this very dark edge to it that I really liked. It has we were trying to explain trip hop to my 10-year-old, which, how do you explain trip hop exactly to a 10-year-old other than just play it? So we played Teardrop by Massive Attack, and you're like, okay, so it's got this beat, which is, sort of in the vein of like hip hop, but then it's adding these layers of like a lot of minor key strings, synths, pianos. And it sounds like late at night in the coolest club you're never going to get into. Like, that's what trip hop sounds to me. And that's what this record sounds like. It sounds like this would be playing in a movie scene where it's like this dark, cool club with beautiful people that are very, on the edge of like, goth meets, future cyberpunk kind of look. But that's, I absolutely love that. Like, I love what he's doing here. You mentioned it, Jay, building these songs up, creating crescendos with strings. There's a lot of really nice bass tones. I don't know if they're physical, organic bass or keyboard bass. He might be mixing those in together, but there's a lot of great sounds, and I appreciated that nothing like deviates so much that it draws your attention. You go, well, this is weird. Why is this in here? Like, it maintains an atmosphere throughout the record while changing things up from song to song. There's no like heavily distorted, song that just breaks in halfway through or something like that. Like, when he uses distortion, it's very tasteful and it's very like crafted for the track. And I do want to mention the vocalist. Like, I think, what's her, Siobhan? I always have a hard time pronouncing that name because it doesn't look like Siobhan. But I really like Drifting. That's really strong song, and I like Missing Piece, the other one that she sings. And I like what Douglas McCarthy is doing on like Stalker, and there's a lot of cool, and what Hildia Campbell does on Red River Cargo and Last Breath. I'm not as in love with like spoken word stuff, but I think it works. It's just like it doesn't work as well as a melodic vocal for me, which we can get to that in the stuff that doesn't work. But let me go to you, Ian. What works for you for this record? Especially, I'd like to know, this is pretty different when you compare it to Depeche Mode in terms of like, it's not about pop singles. It's not about a big hook the way that like, we talked about Violator. Violator is like hit after hit after hit. And there's all great hooks on that record. This is a much more like, listen to it a couple times, get into the groove. It's not as blatantly rewarding as that is. So what works for you on this?
Okay, well, I'll just state for the listeners, I mean, full disclosure, this is definitely my favorite album for the project. And
okay.
I mean, what works? I mean, like, obviously, I mean, I was following the band before listening to this album. So, I mean, in a way, this came to me as part of a natural evolution. Right. It wasn't something that I picked up years later. I mean, I got this when it came out. And so, I mean, throughout the history of Depeche, you can definitely hear the influence that Alan had on the band, and then especially leading up, and I mean, Songs of Faith and Devotion is obviously definitely the poster child for Alan Wilder's involvement and production and studio work with the band. And there are some demos that were released in 2009 for I Feel You, Walk in My Shoes, and Judas. And Judas is the one that I want to highlight because you can hear how Judas evolved. And then especially the last instrumental part of that song. And even with Walk in My Shoes, with the B-side, My Joy, the slow slide mix, which was done by Alan Wilder, and you can hear, okay, this is the direction he was going. This is what he interested him. And then you go into here and you can see it's a continuation. It's not like, yes, this project was born because Alan Wilder was tired of being constrained with that pop song format, and here's an alternative. And this album especially, and you can hear it with the other previous releases as well, it's like, yes, he's not working within that format. One and two had a lot of Depeche samples in it, and he did that on a 4-track studio recorder and created something completely different. But with this, there is still that experimentation, and definitely that element of avant-garde that Depeche had during Alan Wilder's involvement with the band, from Construction Time Again to Devotion, and something unfortunately the band has kind of been missing since he left. I mean, obviously Martin Gore is still very much interested in the electronics and electronic music. You can hear that in Depeche. You can hear that in his own solo albums, and even the project he did with Vince Clarke in 2011, 2012. But that like I said, that avant-garde element is kind of missing, and Alan definitely brought that to the table. Not discounting obviously all the production and studio work he did, but I mean, it's definitely something that shows, yes, Martin and Alan both brought two things to the table that just worked well, melded, and created something that was greater than the sum of its parts. But this album, I mean, like going through the tracks, I mean, like you mentioned, like Drifting and Stalker and Missing Piece, those were the singles. Drifting was the lead single, and then Stalker and Missing Piece were a double A side. Worth noting, that single was completely remixed. I definitely recommend listening to it as well. That single also brought on Paul Kendall, who did the remix with Wilder, and then they would continue to work on the subsequent Recoil releases together. And like you said, I mean, this has that atmosphere. It's very cinematic. I know he commented, I believe it was in the Liquid electronic press kit that was released around the time of the album. And actually, I'm sorry, that was also an enhanced CD, and it was actually included on the album. But he said that, yes, a lot of what he listens to and what he looks at when he goes to music store is soundtracks. It's like, okay, this is how I'm getting that atmosphere, because obviously compared to just general songwriting, I mean, when you're going in for a soundtrack, I mean, look at John Williams. I mean, like, you know, Star Wars and what the emotion that evokes. Same way Superman, yes, very heroic, very hopeful, very triumphant. Indiana Jones, very adventuresome. And then of course Jaws, the dread. So like just looking at those soundtracks from one composer, it's different. They all sound very familiar because you can recognize the style, but and that's what you can hear definitely with these albums from Alan Wilder. You can hear his signature thumbprint all over the music.
Yeah, it's like a like Control Freak, for example. That doesn't sound like that bass line, that sort of like rolling, like dun, 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 like that is in the same vein as like stuff that's happening on Ultra, like that tone.
Yeah.
She sits 2 seats behind his own, can hear him sigh, a little moan. She wonders what he's thinking of as he removes his right hand glove. She notices his hand is strange, as if the bones were rearranged. She thinks of what she'll say to him. She hears it playing deep jumps to his feet just then, slips out the train and round the bend. She almost loses sight of him, shuts her eyes, thinks of his skin. She catches up just as he goes.
And it makes me curious, like, what would have happened if some of this material had David Gahan singing over it? Because there's a lot of really cool stuff on here, but he's got such a unique voice that it did occur to me, like, oh, I wonder what that would have sounded like. But you mentioned about the experimentation, and we talked about it a little bit. Like, I think the thing I appreciate about it is it's there, but it's not overwhelming. So, like, example would be like Shunt. It's like, the 4 minutes of that song, it is what it is. And then it goes to like this double time thing that happens for like the last 2.5 minutes of the song, where it's a really strange rhythm change, but it works really well because it adds this, like, it adds this intensity to the end of the song. But I wouldn't want a whole song like that. Like, it would be too much to do the whole 6.5, 6:47, whatever of that. But I like that change, even though it's weird, in the context of the song. What about you, Jay? Are there parts or any experimentation that you appreciated, or things that you heard that caught your ear, such as that?
Yeah, there's some pretty sophisticated, like, combinations of rhythms and like synth loops and little drum changes that are really cool. Again, it breaks out of you don't always know what the pattern is going to be. And I think for me personally, that's important with electronic music. Like, one of the thing that I negatively react to is, like, when I can pick up the pattern, then I start to get bored. So I think they do a really good job of keeping things varied, and even rhythmically, the way they're combining instruments together, they're not always straightforward. They're a little bit weird sometimes.
Right.
And then so even vocally, the way the vocals coming in or the way the vocals delivered isn't always predictable, which again I think is helping a ton here. In terms of, and there's not a ton of, like, if I was to break down and make a list of the sounds on the record, like, there's a good amount, but there's not like, there is a format here, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like, there is a finite set of sounds that are being used to make the record and to keep sort of a cohesion to it, which I think helps as well. And then they're using a lot of rhythm, I think, to help break things up, or putting in little breaks and whatnot to keep it interesting.
Yeah, his website back in the day, and I believe it's back. A lot of it's been back up there. It went through a couple of changes. Now it kind of includes a lot of archival stuff. But I know back in the day, Shunt, the site that he had had a breakdown of the technical equipment he had.
The thing I want to say, I think it feels performed and arranged rather than like push the button, the 120 beat, 4 on the floor thing goes, and you just kind of like add things on top of it. Like, there's real arrangement happening with these songs, which helps with the building of the tension and the cinematic aspect of the record.
That definitely continued on from Devotion, where there was a lot of the live performance. Like, it wasn't live drums throughout all of I Feel You, for example. I mean, he grabbed the samples, they processed it, digitized it, and then created the loops from it. And a lot of that bits and pieces of performance were grabbed and able to create something that sounded organic, but at the same time is still very electronic.
And I mean, it makes sense because he was able to do that when he was just using, a programmer and a synthesizer with like he was able to still create that sort of like tension and arrangement in his writing. Then that's my impression of all 80s synthesizer band drums.
There's There's a video from 1986 from the Black Celebration era where he's working with the emulator and he's recreating Christmas Island, which was a B-side to A Question of Lust. It was also used as the instrumental opening for the tour. But of course, he's showing, okay, here's the drum pattern, then looping that, and then keeps on adding and building up the song on the emulator.
I find musicians that are really, really good with synthesizers to be pretty amazing, because I watched a documentary about, not documentary, it was like a behind the scenes of how the guys who created the Stranger Things theme did it. They were a band called Survive, and it's two guys. And basically that whole thing is just like it's arpeggio, but then they are constantly like manually turning the envelope filter to create the swell and then the drop and the swell, but you have to turn it in time with the arpeggio, so it has to match the time signature, and it's manual. He can't program that because it's literally a button on his, or a knob on his synthesizer. So I'm always impressed by and people who can not only do that, like manipulate the synthesizer live, but then can also dial in a specific weird sound over and over again, like where you have to turn this, do this, this knob has to go here, and you have to adjust this like 55%, but it's like they're not like looking at a dial, they're just like yep, that's it right there.
Yeah,
and
going by
always,
feel.
Yeah. Jay, is there anything on the record that doesn't work for you?
There's some long intros on the record that don't always, to me, have much to do with the song. I could cut quite a few of those. They feel like segues, but I'm not sure these songs always need segues. I think maybe a couple of them is fine, but I just felt like to get to every song, like to get to the meat of like, oh, okay, here's where the real song starts. It was taking too long, and I was getting bored with a lot of the intros. And then just some of the like 90s trip hop stuff just feels a little, I don't know, dated or cliche to me. It makes it feel like a 90s record. I think the best example is maybe like Drifting is the song that I would say like it's also maybe the most straightforward in terms of, just trying to be like I guess a trip hop song.
It sounds like Sneaker Pimps or
yeah.
It's
very forgettable compared to the rest of the record, I think, which is much more ambitious. So yeah, that's the only stuff that didn't work for me. How about you?
It's the little in Drifting. It's that on the hit, it's like wah, wah. It's got this little like keyboard hit. It's like a double tap, and I've heard that in like a dozen other trip hop songs, and also the record scratching dates it, which I don't necessarily dislike. Like Portishead uses it, and I still love Portishead. And I agree with you. And some of the intros, like Incubus. Like I started the album and I was like, did I turn the album on? Because there was nothing happening for like 25 seconds. And then you just slightly hear something kind of rumbling up. And then it's like 2 minutes by the time the song actually starts to kick in. It's not even like it kicks in. It just, then we start to get to the drum pattern and stuff. And then we got it. So that I did find that like slow build was like almost too slow. I don't necessarily hate a slow build intro, but it was so long that I was questioning whether I actually had press play or not. I don't love Maggie Estep's. Is it my
Maggie Estep? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't love her vocal performances. The one on Luscious Apparatus, it just kind of gets a little over the top for me. It's fine. I just, in general, I'm not a huge fan of like spoken word parts in songs, unless it's like, you know, 2 sentences in a bridge or something like that. So that doesn't necessarily work as well. I think what Douglas McCarthy does with the Francis Ford Coppola dialogue is cool in Incubus. I think also because he's more reserved, that it doesn't jump out as much, whereas she gets very dramatic with her delivery, and it makes sense because she's a spoken word poet and would be like very dramatic and performing as opposed to singing, which you know, that's kind of the route more that Douglas McCarthy, even though he's pronouncing every, you know, or he's not singing, it's spoken, but it's much more ominous sounding. So that didn't exactly work for me. Ian, is there anything that doesn't work for you on the record?
Well, the fact that Stalker and Missing Piece weren't released on vinyl, that's probably the biggest thing that doesn't work for me. But going back to what you said earlier, and even to the Depeche Mode in the 90s, I mean, I didn't see too much about Ultra because I wanted to save a bit for this. I mean, this album and Ultra, I definitely these are 2 albums that are linked. I mean, it helped that probably doesn't help that they came out the same year. And like I said, even in the Depeche round table, I mean, Drifting was released on October 13th, the single. Then the Useless single the following week on the 20th, and then Unsound Methods was released on the 27th. So you had 3 consecutive weeks of that release. But no, I mean, the Ultra and Unsound Methods to me are definitely 2 sides of the same coin. You can hear where both Martin Gore with his songwriting and Alan Wilder with his production and sounds kind of where they've branched off, and these are probably the 2 albums that are closely sound related before there's far more divergence in their later catalogs. But I mean, and it's always kind of wondering it, like Ultra definitely is some of Martin Gore's finest lyrics that he has written for the band, but of course the album is lacking because it doesn't have the atmospherics, and like I said, it's missing that avant-garde element that the previous releases had that kind of hinders it a bit. And then you listen to this album, and Alan Wilder is a fantastic producer and soundscapes and everything, but obviously, I mean, he doesn't have the pop hooks for writing that Martin Gore has. I mean, otherwise, I mean, like this album was promoted. I mean, I've got right here on the Stalker single, because it still has the sticker saying Recoil is Alan Wilder x Depeche Mode, but obviously, I mean, that name in itself wasn't enough to carry over to have as big as commercial success as some people do. It's not like boy bands where they're a giant Voltron of pop music and then they all break off into their own little independent solo stuff. And we've got like a Spice Girls album, then we've got 5 solo albums, or NSYNC, and well, I won't continue on.
Usually it's one person carrying those bands.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Sometimes there's one survivor, but a lot of times it's like, no, they just get back together because they had 5 meandering albums. Not to say that this was a meandering project. I mean, it was successful in its own right, and that Alan Wilder did continue to release subsequent releases. So, but Yeah, but there's not much that doesn't work for me. I mean, when I go, I mean, I'm obviously very familiar with this album, listen to it quite often, but going back to 97, 98, when I was first listening to this, and at first it was like, okay, this is different, but it's familiar. It's like I know what I'm listening to. It's kind of like a comfortable blanket. Like, even though it's different, but it there wasn't anything that really put me off from this album. That it's like, okay, I gotta go back and give this a second listen or another chance. And that wasn't something that just like, okay, it's got the band's name on it, or it's a former member, and it's like, okay, pick it up, and then it's like, okay, it just sits on the shelf, and meanwhile you continue on with the main band. I mean, there's probably several projects out there that the Dig Me Out community can reference, where it's like, yeah, I love the main band, but whatever side project or solo stuff, it's like, yeah, it just collects dust. But this isn't the case for me with Recoil. I mean, I've always, I mean, especially since Alan Wilder has left the Depeche Mode, I mean, I definitely consider a separate entity. And yeah, I count both as part of my 10 favorite bands, where there are some other stuff where it's like, I don't consider it a side projects, because it's like, okay, one, I can pad the list, but dilute. I mean, this is definitely its own entity, its own project, and it deserves the spot.
I'm glad you mentioned that you link this with Ultra, because I kind of now see it as the flip side to Ultra, with the split, with him splitting off from the band. Like, I didn't know I needed this record to like complement Ultra, but now hearing it, I go, oh, okay, this totally makes sense in context to why Ultra was different than the previous two albums from the decade, and what it sounded like with him leaving the band. So I feel like this kind of helps me greater appreciate that record. I know I was the oddball saying that was my favorite record of the decade, or whatever.
There are a lot of Depeche fans out there. I see them on social media who say, yes, Ultra is my favorite record. And like I said, I will not deny that. Like I said, Ultra is definitely Martin Gore's finest lyrical work.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, whether or not people consider it to be part of their Imperial phase, I definitely do. I mean, coming in at number one in the UK again, I mean, following a number one album of Songs of Faith and Devotion, definitely shows that, yes, they were still in their Imperial phase at that point. And it's just unfortunately that's the finish line of their Imperial phase, and Alan Wilder was not there. Whether that's a coincidence or not, who knows? I mean, a lot of people who had success in the 80s and 90s kind of maintained popularity in the 2000s, but it was more their audience had grown and had money than bringing on new fans.
Right. Which a lot of bands, if they don't, expand the fan base, there's it's just the old fans sticking around, there's nothing wrong with that. But yeah, but Depeche Mode, I mean, to their credit, they've been able to still play stadiums, and
oh yeah,
yeah,
they're still touring stadiums
impressive
right now in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, I think there was a concert tonight.
So let's get to our final rating on this record, Jay. Let's talk worthy album, better EP, or decent single. Where do you land?
I'm at a worthy album. I think this is something you can put on passively while you're doing something else, and it's a cool atmospheric thing. I also think some of the storytelling is pretty compelling and fun and interesting in some of the songs. So I'm at a worthy album. There's, like I mentioned, there's a couple moments here that I could lose. It's a little long. All these songs are over 5 minutes, but it's pretty interesting. It's much more avant-garde than I expected. So yeah, I had fun with it. What'd you think?
I agree with you. I did really enjoy this. Worthy album for me. It slots in really well, like sort of in between Depeche Mode and the trip hop that I like, which is an interesting space to be in. So, other than a couple of the Maggie Estep songs, I really liked the rest of the record. And I'm always, I know I've listened to something that I like because I instantly like want to start making some music. Like it inspires me to go, there was that one weird sound and I wonder if I can like get something weird like that. So, and I immediately was like, there was like some bass tone and I was like, ooh, I like that bass. I like the way that bass sounds. I wonder if I can recreate that. And then usually I can't and I give up and don't make anything. It's what happens because I'm sitting there just like getting frustrated. Like, why can't I get that thick tone that he's getting? I was like, oh, because he's not using an Apple GarageBand plugin. He's actually using the real gear that's necessary to make that sound. So yeah, worthy album for me. Ian, it's perfunctory, but I'm going to say is a worthy album for you. Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. Like I said, this is my favorite album for the project. It's always been one of my favorites. I mean, even going back to university, it was going on the bus ride home from university to my parents. I mean, this was always one that went into the CD slipcase to bring on my backpack so I can listen to music on the bus.
Well, there weren't a lot of votes, but they were for worthy album, 100%.
Yeah, that actually is mine because I noticed when I was looking to see if there was any comments to address. So, like I said,
you're allowed to vote on your own record. It's all right.
Yeah, but like I wasn't going to, but like I said earlier, I mean, this is definitely one I knew. I know even for any subsequent picks that I make, I mean, I'm not going to get the response unless I pick a band like Ministry or KMFDM where there's a bit more of a name recognition.
Sure. What I found interesting just when I was doing the research is that if you go to Ultra's Wikipedia page, it lists the genres as alternative rock and trip hop.
Yeah,
which I don't really hear those in Depeche Mode's Ultra. But if you go to Unsound Methods Wikipedia page, the genre is electronica, which I don't hear electronica because I think of like the Prodigy, being electronica, Chemical Brothers,
especially that big band or big beat sound.
The big beat sound, and this is not big beat at all. It's almost like they have like this to me is the trip hop end of it.
Yeah, and I mean, like Depeche had trip hop sounds. I mean, especially in the Devotional tour where Alan Wilder reworked "World in My Eyes" and "Fly on the Windscreen," and those had a lot more of the trip hop elements, especially when compared to their studio recordings.
Well, Ian, thank you so much for bringing this record to us. A perfect, companion episode to our Depeche Mode roundtable from a couple months ago.
Yeah, this was one that I initially considered for my inaugural pick, and then I'm like, no, I need the Depeche Mode in the 90s when they lost.
You had to line it up.
I had to line it up, like I said. I mean, because obviously, I mean, if we didn't have that episode, I mean, we could have easily gone down the Depeche Mode rabbit hole too easily. I mean, last year they lost to The Cure and that, so then I had to pivot and decide, okay, I'm gonna try to find something else for a pick. But then when I knew I had the round table, it's like, okay, I'm doing this.
Well, yeah, that worked out perfectly with that episode and this episode. So it gives everybody a nice little bookend pair of episodes if they want to learn about all the Depeche Mode happenings in the 90s or associated.
Yeah, I think this is one of the rare Dig Me Out episodes that has a sister episode.
It's true. And, usually it's just from us reviewing the same band twice.
Yeah.
Like your Paws and your Seaweeds and a few other ones.
Yeah, so I think Soundgarden's the only other one where you get a round table, and then
I
for
believe
their
you're right.
80s. Yeah.
Well, if people listening to this are curious what we're talking about with all these Patreon things and polls and that sort of stuff, you can join us at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com, and you get to vote in our monthly album tournament polls. A whole bunch of albums enter, one album leaves, suggested by folks through digmeoutpodcast.com. We had a lot of suggestions in the past week, a lot of stuff I had never heard of coming in over the last week from people whose name I didn't recognize unless Rich is using other aliases as he submits things. Just kidding, Rich. We love you. It's also where you go to sign up for the Box newsletter, which comes out weekly via our Substack. It is a release calendar of new 80s, 90s, and aughts related music, movies, TV shows, books, etc., plus 2 1-minute reviews of new releases. And finally, Apple Podcasts is where you go to sign up, or excuse me, to leave feedback for us about this show, preferably in the positive end of things. That's the ones that will keep our egos properly stroked. So, Ian, thank you once again for joining us.
Yes, thanks for having me.
For Jay, I'm Tim. We're out, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Dig Me Out.